Today we're going to look at the work of Erving Goffman and Hochschild. We expand on the author's summary of Goffman's dramaturgy. They omit one of his central analytical insights, the frame and frame analysis, which we'll cover in a little bit of detail here. We'll start with Goffman's work, which he labeled dramaturgy. We should note that while Goffman works theoretically in interpersonal interactions, he also works at a society-wide cultural level as well. His analysis of how media provides context forms the basis of frame analysis. This is not covered in your text. We'll give you a few examples of this. It is one of these theories, as was network analysis, that is relevant even today, or perhaps more so, than when it was originally penned in the mid-20th century. So too, Goffman's work on mental hospitals provides a baseline for our contemporary analysis of the dehumanizing aspects of the prison system. We'll start with dramaturgy, though, the interactional component that is covered to some degree in your text. Goffman asserts that our lives are performances. This does not mean that we are, quote, putting on an act in the colloquial sense of the word, which implies intentional deceptiveness, but that we act all the time. When we act, we do take into consideration what Goffman terms our audience. What is this audience? You are an audience for this video. If we have an interaction over the email, we're sort of each other's audience, if you will. But our actions are cued and shaped by the context in which we undertake them. Think about this for a minute. Your interactions with your grandparents are different than the interactions you might have with your friends, or with your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, or with people with whom you work. We are similarly more formalized in our interactions with work, co-workers, professors, healthcare providers, and so forth, than with people with whom we are more familiar with. So what does this mean? Goffman's central concept here is what he terms impression management. Now, Goffman differentiates between impressions given, the explicit meaning of the content of our interactions, and impressions given off. And I will describe a little bit about what that means. Impressions given is the explicit meaning. Think, for example, of an everyday convention. If you ask anyone how they're doing, unless you really know them, they're going to go, oh, I'm just fine, even though they might be dying or having a breakdown. Now, impressions given would be this lecture. Impressions given off, which I manage or try to out of these interactions, and sometimes you may have noted my edits are not that good, I will go through and take a few hours and eliminate the ums and the ers and the kind of brain clouds, verbal brain clouds and holding places that accompany my everyday talk, even when I'm reading off a script as I am now. There's an example of impression management. But let's get back to this example of impressions given. So that's explicit content. Impressions given off are the contextual elements. Facial expressions, cues, the context, who I'm talking to if I ask, how are you? Imagine two spouses who are having an argument. And one spouse goes, how are you? And the other spouse goes, well, I'm just fine. Clearly, they're not really just fine, are they? Their impression given off is where the message is carried. So, impressions given off are the context for the messages that we do and we engage in everyday exchanges and in management impressions that we're giving. Similarly, if I were to give a lecture here as if I were getting ready to go to the pool and I have no shirt on and goggles on top of me, well, you certainly wouldn't have much attention paid to the fact that I'm trying to deliver you material, but to my bizarre appearance. More on that example in a minute. Impression management is also contingent on the stakes. Goffman talks about the front or front stage behavior and back or backstage behavior. For those of you with some training in theater, you know that this is important. Front stage is where the action is going on. Backstages are where the props, costumes, and context or setting takes place. So setting means everything. Have you ever worked in a restaurant, a sit-down restaurant? If you have, or you've been to one, or you know anybody who works in one, you know there's a front stage behavior where the wait staff engages the customers with a certain demeanor and in order to manage a certain impression. And then a backstage area where you're basically, the wait staff takes orders and shoots them to a chef and some cooks. There are dishwashers there. It's noisy. There's very little impression management going on. There's just information. Right? So that's basically a good metaphor for front stage and backstage behavior. If we think about our everyday life, there are times when we manage our impression more or less, depending on the context in which we find ourselves. If I'm alone at home, I'm going to relax my impression management completely. If I'm on a job interview, however, my impression management, both given and given off, is going to be heightened. So, we need to talk a minute about another concept that's not emphasized too much in your text. The concept of the frame. Frame and frame analysis is context impression on a large scale. It is impression management writ on a cultural level. A frame is a context within which impressions are given or given off. Back to my example of this video. You see my home office. There are books. There are pictures on the wall. I probably, having said this, should tidy it up a little. Maybe you've noticed a backdrop, but sometimes I had the closet open. It's closed now. But basically, you're probably focused on my talking head at this point. So this is a frame. It's a context. Now, for example, if I gave this video, this mini lecture, again, as I said earlier, as if I was going to the pool with no shirt on and goggles on my head, it would be odd. It would be a disruption of context or misframing. And it would take me off message. I would have failed in managing the impression that I want to give off, that I have authoritative knowledge of this material. It would be breaking frame. Now think about this in terms of electronic media. We've talked about the impact of the internet. Some of these theories, exchange theory, the last chapter in online dating, you may remember, some of these theories were almost prescient in their assessment of where we were going and how we're going to frame particular topics. Think about the media. Think about the Russian paid Facebook ads in the election last year in 2016 that won't go away. This is an intentional attempt at misframing or presenting material with a false context in order to foment political division. Notice I said false context, not fake news. So what would happen? A topic that was controversial in some quarters, say a woman's right to choose versus right to life, or GBLT marriage versus people that think marriage should be between a man and a woman, or gun control versus gun rights. All of these things were framed in such a way to foment division between people. Finally, Goffman's concept of the total institution is one that we must consider in terms of contemporary goings-on in the news. Think about Abu Ghraib in George W. Bush's administration. Think about the Philip Zimbardo. You may be familiar with the prison experiment. These were all presaged by Erving Goffman's definition of the total institution. Now, what is a total institution? Goffman at the time was analyzing mental hospitals, also known as asylums. We don't use that language, asylum, anymore. They're now mental hospitals. And there was a great release of many of the people who were considered mentally ill in the early 1970s. There was a cultural shift, a societal shift in the way we treat mental illness, sometimes not for the good. That said, Goffman studied mental hospitals in the early 1950s. Well, what happened? Well, a mental patient's ability to manage their impression was basically taken away, and was the way mental illness was treated at that time, was taken away from it, was stripped down, it was stripped away. In other words, they were reduced to sort of a blank slate upon which a new set of behaviors, criteria, norms, values was written, with the person's original set being completely swept away. This concept is called resocialization, and the context in which it is applicable today in 2017 would be basic training in the military, where you have to basically have your individuality subsumed so that you connect with a group, and also prisons. Prisons are places where resocialization goes on afoot. So these are the concepts of Erving Goffman, and they influence greatly our next theorist that we're going to talk about, Arlie Hochschild. Hochschild took impression management one step further, and she discussed emotion management. Emotion management wasn't merely managing impressions and impressions given off. It was the actual management of emotions and what she called the commodification of feeling. Well, where does this happen? Perhaps you have a job where you have to deal with the public. You have to, in other words, sort of double yourself and not be yourself when you're addressing somebody directly. You have to be, quote, professional, unquote, although that's not what that word means. Hochschild studied flight attendants in Delta Airlines in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The managed heart, the commodification of feeling, was groundbreaking in that she asserted emotions can be managed in a manner similar to impressions. They were extension of emotion management of impressions. At that time, flight attendants were mostly women. They were called stewardesses. We don't use that language anymore, really. And flight attendants were basically supposed to be servile, okay? They were supposed to, unlike today, they're more like train conductors were, and they have some authenticity in terms of power. They can tell you to sit down and unplug your material. Right? At that time, they were supposed to be waitresses. Hochschild did a field study of flight attendants and saw them having to manage their feelings, particularly when they were dealing with an unruly passenger. A man or a woman might be drunk, or they might be in a rage and so forth, or they might be unduly angry, or they might be making a sexual advance. The flight attendants were trained at Delta Airlines to do a sort of emotion doubling. What they did was they were instructed to pretend as if the unruly passenger was a child. And they were supposed to manufacture feelings that represented that. And it was called deep feeling. They were supposed to really feel that that person was just a child and that they should be treated that way, rather than to get angry, which would have been an authentic response. Increasingly, this idea of the commodification of feelings, or that you're supposed to manufacture an emotional state and then really live there, was called the commodification of feeling. And Hochschild identified feeling rules that had to do with one's work world, usually. And these feeling rules were different than the rules that one might experience in one's everyday life. In other words, capacity for Marx's alienated labor was there in the impression management that these flight attendants were forced to do. They weren't alienated from the product of their labors as in a physical sense, as was a 19th century factory worker. They were alienated from their authentic feelings about a particular situation. The rules which dominated this commodification of feelings are called feeling rules. We should note here that Hochschild also made one adroit observation. These feeling rules are different for men than they are for women. Although the nature of working as a flight attendant has changed, we can still see all sorts of contexts in which this commodification of feelings takes place. Almost any interaction with the public in terms of a customer base has to do with this commodification of feelings. Men and women have different sets of rules. Nevertheless, the assumption is that one has to manage one's feelings. I saw firsthand evidence of this the other day when I had to buy a tire. I wanted to buy a tire. An individual had to have brake works done, and they would not believe the tire guy. They thought that he was trying to charge them extra money. And he was very calm. He explained why. He showed the person why. And she kept pushing and pushing and pushing and wanting a quote and wanted to haggle. And he said, I don't like where this is going. He was very calm. But if I compare this with how mechanics were a generation ago, mechanics today have to deal with people who watch YouTube videos and think that they know how to replace brakes. I certainly would not attempt to do so. I'm going to leave that in his hands, and I'm going to listen basically to what he tells me. That said, everyone has become an expert, and so people are called on not only to do their work, but increasingly in public interactions with people as consumers, they are called on to arrange and manage their feelings in a way that belies their true, authentic assessment of the situation. Okay, thank you very much, and enjoy reading through this material.